Hello, everyone. My name is Alessandra Melito. I am the retirement reporter at MarketWatch. I'm joined today by Mark Kanchowitz, author of How to Appeal for More College Financial Aid, Betsy Mayotte, president of the Institute of Student Loan Advisors, and Mike Pierce, executive director at Student Borrower Protection Center. Welcome, Mark, Betsy, and Mike.
Thank you.
Hi.
Thanks.
So this is a hot topic. Everybody wants to talk about student loans, whether it's forgiveness or just how to, pick the right loan. I mean, this is an important discussion for everyone's lives. So I'm just going to dive right in and start with you, Betsy. How have you seen this pause affect borrowers? And if you don't mind, just briefly explain what exactly has been going on these last 2 years.
Yeah, sure thing. So beginning March 13th of 2020, the vast majority of federal student loan borrowers saw that their payments were put on hold and their interest rates were dropped to 0%. Now, that initial pause was only supposed to be for a few months, but we've had multiple extensions. So at this point, those loans are still on pause, enjoying a 0% interest rate and aren't due to resume at this point until September. Now, back in March of 2020, if you remember the first few months of the pandemic, there were a lot of people that were severely economically impacted by the pandemic. For example, people in hospitality, they saw their jobs just shut down. So having their student loan payments not be due during this period was a lifesaver to a lot of these borrowers who needed that income to pay their rent, pay for groceries, the light bill, etc. Even those borrowers that weren't as significantly economically impacted by the pandemic also were able to take advantage of this pause to, for example, pay down higher interest debt or build an emergency fund or pay down private loans that may not have had the pause.
That's a great point. I have seen in my own reporting a little bit of all of that. So, Mark, this has been a long pause. We are talking 2 years. How much do you suspect borrowers have saved from that zero interest in this time? And what are the challenges associated with restarting anytime soon?
And so by August 31st, it will have been a total of 30 months, which is 2.5 years. The total interest saved by these borrowers is in excess of $145 billion. That's about $120 per borrower per month. Now, if we were to count the total payments that they weren't paying, that's double or triple that. The payment pause and interest waiver has been designed to put the loans into hibernation. So the loans will be the same when repayment restarts as they were before the pandemic. However, the pause payments did count towards loan forgiveness programs such as public service loan forgiveness. 30 months of pause payments is a quarter of the 120 payment obligation. Now, unemployment rates for college graduates are the same now as they were before the pandemic. Delinquency and forbearance rates for loans that weren't eligible for the payment pause have also normalized. In fact, the delinquency rates are a little bit better now than they were before the pandemic. So it seems unlikely that the sky is going to be falling when repayment resumes. Some borrowers will struggle, but no more so than before the pandemic. However, I think there may be some teething pains when repayment restarts. It's similar to the 6-month grace period after you graduate before repayment starts on your student loans. When borrowers are late with a payment, they are more likely to be late with that very first payment than any other payment. So we might see a slight temporary jump in delinquency rates for the student loans, but nothing major. Now, the current extension may not be the last. Restarting repayment 2 months before an election would be political suicide. So I doubt they're going to restart repayment in September. There'll probably be a 7th extension beyond the elections and maybe into next year.
I'm sure those extensions, while welcome, probably don't help the delinquency rates with all the confusion that there has been lately. And I'm sure we'll get to that shortly. But Mike, I had a question for you. What do you expect to see in the coming months regarding student loans? We've talked a lot about the pause, but should we hold our breath for any sort of forgiveness?
So Mark mentioned the possibility of a next payment pause extension. I do think that's quite likely. Everything that we've heard from the administration over the course of the past couple of weeks suggests that the pause on student loan payments is going to get extended. It is going to stretch out into 2023, maybe beyond. But maybe more importantly, it sets up this very dramatic moment for President Biden, where he is going to have this opportunity with the whole world watching to finally cancel student debt for everybody, as he pledged during his campaign, as the law allows. And that's a really interesting dynamic because it also helps address some of the structural problems that Mark and Betsy both identified. People haven't paid student loan bills in more than 2 years. And if you clear borrowers out of the system, the mechanical exercise for the student loan market becomes much easier. And it does have this outsized political benefit for the president.
Student loan forgiveness, I know, is a very, very controversial topic. So this question is for everyone, but I will start with you, Mark. What are some of the arguments in favor and against forgiveness?
Well, some of the arguments in favor are during the last economic downturn, the banks got bailed out, but the borrowers didn't. Also, borrowers have been experiencing economic distress due to the pandemic and inflation and other aspects of the economy. So maybe they need some financial relief. There are also social equity claims, such as particular types of borrowers, such as Black borrowers being more likely to have higher debt and more likely to be affected, less likely to build social wealth because of it. And there's also a kind of specious claim that this will stimulate the economy. To some extent, not having to pay your student loans does give you more money, which some people might argue contributes to inflation. But some of the arguments against forgiveness include, why would you forgive the student loans of a borrower who is capable of repaying their student loans? It's better to maybe focus on targeted loan forgiveness for, say, disabled and elderly borrowers who are struggling to repay their student loans. A third of senior citizens who have student loans are in default on those student loans. Half of borrowers age 75 and older are in default on their student loans. And maybe restore the right to a bankruptcy discharge to help deal with this. And another public policy argument is that loan forgiveness doesn't increase the number of students enrolling in college or graduating from college. It might be better to use the same amount of money to double or triple the Pell Grant, which does increase college access and success. And obviously, if they get more grants, they're going to need to borrow less. So it will reduce the debt at graduation for low-income students. Low-income students, Pell Grant recipients, are more likely to borrow student loans than middle and high-income students. And they also graduate with more student loan debt.
Those are really great points. Mike or Betsy, do either of you want to chime in?
I would just add that it's a little bit of a false choice here between providing more grant aid to low-income students to pay for college and providing relief for people that have student debt right now. We would love to see Congress step in and provide more grant aid to low-income students. That would be a fantastic outcome for America and for those families. But Joe Biden doesn't have the ability to act on his own without Congress to boost grant aid to low-income students. He can cancel student debt for everybody. He could do it tomorrow if he wanted to.
Yeah, and I would just add, as far as the benefits to forgiveness, Mark mentioned some data about how old the average student loan borrower is. Half of all borrowers are over the age of 30, a quarter are over the age of 45. So student debt, and I see it every day in our work, prevents people from retiring, slows down their retirement savings, holds back and delays the opportunity for people to buy a home or start a family. So those are all arguments in favor of total student loan forgiveness. One point that I hear from people that are against loan forgiveness is that broad student loan forgiveness doesn't solve the problem. It relieves the symptom. The problem is the cost of higher education. So the detractors are saying, why would you forgive student debt if it's just going to start accruing again the very next day? We need to actually spend the money on what causes the loans to accrue in the first place.
I hate to beat a dead horse here, but the Congress has to spend money to boost grants to students or to make college cheaper. Congress doesn't have to spend any money to cancel student debt. And for the people that have it, it's life-changing. And if I make college free for your son or daughter, that's not going to do anything for my student loans.
That's right.
I actually disagree with Mike on two regards. The president doesn't have the ability to forgive student loans with the stroke of a pen. Congress can do it, and the president could through issuing new regulations, which is a much more than just a single stroke of a pen. I mean, he could and create a new student loan forgiveness program by issuing new regulations in the income contingent repayment plan. As far as not spending money to forgive student loans, yes, it's an immediate bookkeeping transaction, but the federal government borrowed money through the U.S. Treasury in order to fund these loans. Those treasuries need to be repaid by the federal government. The money for that, if it's not coming from the student loan payments, has to come from somewhere. So Congress actually does have to appropriate money to forgive those student loans. Doesn't mean it can't, but they need to do it.
Those are all very good points. And like I said before, obviously a very controversial topic. I am going to just keep on going for time's sake, but I know this is something that we talk about constantly. Betsy, what strategies have you seen borrowers, and I know that we've mentioned it before, but I just want to reiterate it. What strategies have you seen borrowers employ regarding their student debt during this pause? I mean, I have seen some people who are saving that money and then plan to just throw a whole ton of it at their student loans when the pause is over. Some are spending it for other reasons. What have you seen with the borrowers you've worked with?
Yeah, it's been really neat to watch. As I mentioned, that in the beginning of the pandemic, when we sort of had that big economic lurch and no one knew what was going to happen, I was happy to see people building up emergency funds, which was something that needed to happen. Paying down high interest credit card debt with what would have been their student loan payment. Now that we're so far into it, I am seeing a lot more borrowers who are pretending to make their student loan payment, but they're making it into some sort of interest-bearing account, even if it's just a little bit of interest that they're earning on that money. And then the plan is to make that payment as a lump sum right before that 0% interest rate holiday, so to speak, ends, whether that be in September or whether that be next year. I've also seen borrowers who have, in addition to their federal student loans, private loans. Now, private loans tend to have few, if any, of these opportunities for relief. If there is broad student loan forgiveness, it almost certainly will not include private student loans. So I have seen borrowers taking advantage of this 0% rate on the federal loans and not being due for payment to try to pay down or pay off their private loans.
Yeah, I have seen just, talking to family and friends, a little bit of that too, but I'm sure, everybody's approaching this a lot differently. And Mike, this question is for you. Are there any people in particular who are bearing the brunt of student debt, and how has the pandemic affected those borrowers as well as everybody else?
Absolutely. The student debt crisis disproportionately affects Black people, brown people, first generation college students. People that have student debt look like the parts of America that are often left behind by our economic policy. They're the communities that have struggled the most to regain firm financial footing after the pandemic, the economy started to recover from the pandemic. And by and large, the people that are making student loan payments and the people that struggled the most before the pandemic are the folks that we worry the most about when we start the student loan system up again. Another student loan borrower defaulted every 26 seconds, more than 1 million people a year before the student loan pause was put in place back in March. And we have done basically nothing to prevent that from repeating itself if we were to turn student loan payments back on again.
Definitely. And this question is also for everyone, but I will start with you, Betsy. How can people prepare right now for repayment? And are there any other practical tips that you think might be helpful for borrowers to know and keep in mind if they might be stressing out a little bit about everything?
Well, where do I start? So, Along with this student loan repayment pause, there's been a lot of other stuff going on within the student loan industry. One of those things has been the change of a lot of the large student loan servicers. So for that reason, one of the first things that borrowers should be doing to prepare now is make sure they know who has their loans, because it may have changed. If you aren't sure who has your loans, the best way to find out is to log on to the Department of Education's website, which is studentaid.gov. And if you log in there, it'll show you where all your federal loans are, who the current holder is, how to get in touch with them, and so on. The next step is to make sure that your loan holder knows where to find you so that you don't miss any important updates, such as when your next payment is going to be due, whether that be September or next February. If you've been on an income-driven plan and you're going to need to renew it, it's important that you know when that renewal date is going to be. So reach out to whoever's holding your loan, make sure they have your correct contact information, snail mail, email, phone number. And then once you do that, and listen, I am just as guilty of this as anybody else. We pay all our bills online now, so the mail piles up because you don't get around to opening it. Especially when it comes to your student loan and we get close to the end of this pause, open all the things. Open all the emails, open all the snail mails, just to make sure you don't miss any type of important deadline. If you aren't sure, if you're stressing about being able to afford your payment, you can figure out now which payment plan might fit your budget and fit your long-term financial strategy right now. The Department of Education, our website, there's a bunch of other websites out there, have these great calculators where you just need to punch your information in once, and it'll tell you what your payment will be under each of the lower payment options you might be eligible for, whether that might qualify you for forgiveness, and most importantly, how much that payment plan will cost you over time. Because of course, the name of the game is to pay the least amount over time. The final tip that I would give in our limited time for borrowers to pay attention to between now and whenever the pause ends is watch out for scams. Unfortunately, with all this upheaval, that's fodder for the scammers, and we're seeing more and more activity. So if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. If you're not sure if they're legitimately your servicer or legitimately attached to the Department of Education, delete the email, hang up the phone, look up your actual loan holder's website and call the number on that website to check it out.
Those are really great tips. I know when in doubt, just go directly to the source. Don't rely on the email or the text or anything like that. That's a great point. Mark, do you have any suggestions for what borrowers should be thinking about?
Oh, and also I'd stress that the U.S. Department of Education has a toll-free number, 1-800-4-FED-AID, 1-800-433-3243, that you can call for information about your student loans. In addition to updating your contact information with the loan servicer, I would suggest going on to studentaid.gov and making sure they have your up-to-date information, because when repayment does restart, they're going to send you a half dozen notices, and they need your up-to-date contact information to do that. Something that you could start doing now is to budget for the restart of repayment, maybe a descriptive budget where you track your spending for a month and see how much of it is a need versus how much of it is a want, so that you can see where you might be able to cut your spending to carve out money for your student loan payments. Because during the pandemic, and when you had more money, you might have increased your spending to consume all available cash. So one thing you might want to do is sign up for auto pay if you haven't already. And certainly if you're already signed up, you'll need to make sure your bank account information hasn't changed, because that automatically transfers your money from your bank account to the loan servicer. You're not only going to be less likely to be late with payment, but you'll get a 0.25 percentage point interest rate reduction, which will save you money. And if you're saving the money now, you can build a buffer for the restart of repayment, maybe save a third of your monthly payment this month, 2/3 next month, the full amount the month after that, so that you get used to spending the money on student loan payments instead of other priorities. Plus, with another benefit of auto pay is, and you quickly get used to not having the money in your bank account. A couple of things that I'd like to emphasize that haven't been mentioned. The limited public service loan forgiveness waiver runs through October 31st. If you are pursuing public service loan forgiveness, it's an opportunity to have loans from the FFEL program counted towards loan forgiveness. You just consolidate them and then your past payments count. They're also going to count partial payments and late payments towards that loan forgiveness. So this is a good way to get a few extra payments counted. And then the Biden administration just announced that they will have a fresh start initiative when repayment does restart, where borrowers who were in default or delinquent at the start of the pandemic will be returned to a current status, and the delinquencies and defaults will be removed from their credit history, which will help them improve their credit scores, which will help them qualify for new credit. It's very important that you take steps to not default again. And you have this opportunity. If you're struggling financially, look into the economic hardship deferment, unemployment deferment, general forbearances, as well as income-driven repayment plans. With income-driven repayment plans, your monthly payment could be zero if your income is less than 150% of the poverty line. So take a few steps, figure out, and try to do it earlier rather than later, because there'll be a rush of people trying to call the lenders, the loan servicers, the date repayment resumes. So if you can take care of it earlier or do it through the web interface, through email, that may be better than waiting on infinite hold while calling the lender's call center.
Those are also great points. So I see a lot of audience questions popping up, but Mike, I wanted to give you an opportunity. Is there anything else you'd like to add for tips and suggestions for borrowers?
Betsy and Mark really covered the high points, but I think your takeaway from hearing all of that is that this is overwhelming and incredibly complicated. And often the student loan companies you call for help don't know any better than you do. And I would trust the information that comes directly from the U.S. Department of Education. Studentaid.gov is a great place to go for resources. And if you see something that suggests you should be eligible for a lower payment or debt cancellation under one of these new initiatives from the Biden administration, and your student loan company sells you a different story, you should get help from a regulator. Consumerfinance.gov, it's the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. They are the regulator for the student loan industry. And we do hear routinely that companies provide people with bad information. And it's important to ask for help and to know your rights.
Great. Well, thank you so much for all of those suggestions. I'm going to just dive right into audience questions because there are many. I will start with Nora, who asked, wouldn't the 0% interest rate be a great incentive to pay down loans with everything going to principal? Betsy, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, it's interesting. And I'm glad we get this question because one of the phenomenons I noticed during this pause, which this pause is also aligned with this long conversation about whether President Biden is going to offer broad student loan forgiveness or not, or whether Congress would. And I heard from a lot of borrowers that said, listen, forgiveness would be great, but I just want to feel like I'm on a level playing field, and permanently lowering or permanently eliminating the interest would be a way to do that. So I'm not surprised that she asked this question. And, as we mentioned before, during this pause, I've seen quite a few borrowers that have been able to pay significant amounts of their student debt down because of the 0% interest. So it's a valid question.
Definitely. I actually have a question. So and this is in regards to Nora's question, if people have been paying down this whole time and then, President Biden turns around and does forgive some of the student loans, at least, what happens then? The people who might have been saving it in an account, obviously they might not have to put as much of their savings into that account, into their debt. But what then for the borrowers who have been paying down this whole time?
I think it depends on the program, too. I would say the Department of Education is in the refund business right now. Borrowers that are qualifying for public service loan forgiveness under these new rules, the new waiver that Mark mentioned before, are getting refund checks for extra payments they've made beyond 10 years. borrowers that are going to qualify for debt cancellation under income-driven repayment based on this new announcement yesterday, these borrowers are also going to get checks back from the federal government. It seems less likely that if Joe Biden canceled student debt for everybody with the stroke of a pen, that refunds would work quite that way. But I would say never. And certainly there are people that have been making payments now that didn't need to that are getting money back right now.
Very interesting. So
about 500,000 borrowers have continued to make payments during the payment pause. That's 1.1%. You don't want to make payments if you're expecting to get loan forgiveness. If you're working towards public service loan forgiveness or the 20 or 25-year forgiveness at the end of an income-driven repayment plan, don't make payments that aren't required. So saving the money in a bank account to make it possible for you to make the payments when payments resume, that's a good idea. Also, President Biden has only called for $10,000 in loan forgiveness. Senator Warren and Schumer have called for $50,000 in loan forgiveness. So there's a good chance you're still going to be left with some student loan debt, even if loan forgiveness occurs. So I wouldn't make a change assuming that all of your loans are going to be forgiven when it may be part of your loans.
Yeah, and I just want to add, and it's very rare that Mike and I disagree. But while we have seen refunds with PSLF and so on, the Department of Ed has been pretty clear that if the loan is paid in full, there are no refunds and they're not going to reopen. So I just think we need to be careful in that scenario. I predict that if there is broad student loan forgiveness and someone has paid their loan in full, they're not going to get money back.
Yeah, I would agree with that. That's
so.
So no, we don't disagree after all.
That's great. So in the interest of time, I want to try to get 2 more questions in, and we only have about a few minutes left. This one is from Henry, who asked, what about those recent graduates who worked through college and graduated without debt? It's not fair to them, is it? Shouldn't they be considered as part of this economic equation? Mike, do you want to take that one?
I'm happy to take a shot at that. I think that's to the credit of everyone that's able to navigate through going to college without taking on debt. That's a minority of people now. That's an increasingly rare experience. But it's also important, and I do want to take just a second to say, part of the reason why we need to cancel student debt for everybody is because the student loan system hasn't lived up to the promises that policymakers have made for decades. That's somebody that made it through college without taking on debt. But there's lots of people that have debt that were promised affordable payments, promised debt cancellation, and denied those rights and protections. And so part of the justice argument here for canceling debt for everybody is making those borrowers whole, people that were actually hurt by the student loan system.
Mark, I have a question for you. This one's a good one. Crystal asked, why is the Biden administration having a hard time forgiving all student loans?
Well, the President Biden doesn't have the legal authority to forgive student loans with the stroke of a pen. He's been focusing on his authority, his current legal authority, and trying to maximize the forgiveness that borrowers get through the existing programs that have already been authorized by Congress. He's forgiven more student loan debt than any previous president. And just in his first year or so, he's forgiven $17.5 billion of student loan debt. The initiative that was announced yesterday with regard to forbearance steering, that's going to forgive immediately probably an additional $2 billion. So he will have forgiven $20 billion right off the bat. But he is uncertain about his legal authority to forgive student loans through executive action. And there's a high likelihood that if he were to pursue that, it would be met with a legal challenge and ultimately overturned. He wants to deliver for borrowers rather than taking a swing and missing.
So I think next time we're going to have to talk for at least an hour to get through just all of this, but or some of this, really, to be honest with you. But unfortunately, that is all the time that we have for today. I just want to thank you all for listening, and thank you for joining this discussion, Mark, Betsy, and Mike.